This situation with Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic is absolutely wild. It is amazing to me just how much the UFC seems like they would be content to just let that entire heavyweight division. I mean, that is their breadwinner. It's supposed to be that's supposed to be the breadwinner division, for any combat sport. I mean, not really with any, great reason. It's just that people seem to think that the biggest guys, the biggest, strongest guys hitting each other, they seem to think that there's something glamorous about it. Uh, I don't really necessarily like. I do understand the appeal of that. I don't so much share the level of enthusiasm for it. I mean, I do like the heavyweight division, but there are better divisions than heavyweight. But it's the one that, in boxing, in the UFC, when things are, when all things considered, it's supposed to be, in theory, one of the big moneymaker divisions. And right now, they have really managed to create an incredible cock up, with the whole situation surrounding the heavyweight championship of the world. So much so as a guy that became the interim heavyweight champion of the world has actually become the interim heavyweight champion and defended the interim heavyweight championship before the actual champion has had even one title defense. And there's a lot to be said about everything that's going on, but I mean, Dana White had an interesting confrontation with the media this past week, where basically they were asking him, it's like, well, why don't you just, like, first of all, why is Jon Jones, the pound for pound number one fighter right now, in your opinion, when he hasn't even really fought very much, like he's fought once in the last 4 years? I mean, and Dana's explanation for that is like, oh, well, he's a great fighter. In Dana White's opinion, he's the greatest fighter to ever do it. And he is, in theory, an active fighter. Because he was training for that fight with Stipe Miocic, and then he got injured. So now he's got to take time to recover from that injury. And I would almost say fair enough to that side of it. That's something everybody's talking about. The thing that really nobody seems to be talking about is the whole idea of what's been going on with Stipe Miocic. You want to talk about guys that haven't fought in 4 years. Stipe Miocic, he hasn't fought in 4 years, like, at all. Like, he was the heavyweight champion of the world, and then he lost that to Francis Ngannou, with a devastating knockout. And one thing that I think that a lot of people don't really stop to consider with MMA is that typically when a fighter is knocked out, that comes that comes with it, at least some length of a medical suspension, especially if there's a concussion involved in that. And with knockouts, obviously, frequently there is a concussion involved. So it isn't entirely Stipe Miocic's fault that he hasn't fought in the last 4 years. But at the same time, at a certain point, yeah, it is his fault that he hasn't fought in the last 4 years. That is a choice that he has made, and sure, statistically, by the numbers, he is the greatest heavyweight in the history of the UFC. But also at a certain point, I kind of feel like if you don't stay active, then really you're just a name. Like, you're just kind of you're just kind of floating on your laurels. This is supposed to be a combat sport. You're supposed to fight for everything that you have. And I would say that right now, this title fight is not something that Stipe Miocic has earned by fighting. He's just, statistically the greatest heavyweight in the history of the UFC. So they're just like, yeah, okay, you can fight for the title. Really no question about where Stipe was pretty much the entire time that Francis Ngannou was the champion. I mean, those guys are 1-1 with each other. Theoretically, at some point, there should have been a rubber match, but no, there was not. And then when Francis moved on to the to the PFL, he could have stepped up at some point and said that he was ready to fight for the championship. Then, and at that point, it had at least been more recent, to his most recent fight. But he didn't do that. He just kind of sat out. It's kind of hard to escape the impression that maybe he, like Jon Jones, and by the way, there's absolutely no question that Jon Jones was doing this, but maybe Stipe, like Jon Jones, was just kind of waiting out Stipe Miocic, waiting out Francis Ngannou, and waiting for Francis to move on, so that it was, in theory, safe to return to the heavyweight division. It's kind of hard to escape the impression, as much as I think that nobody really wants to think that about Stipe. It's kind of hard to escape that impression. But I think that the biggest issue underlying all of this really does come down to one word in particular, and that is inactivity. I guess maybe not just the word inactivity, but inactivity plus the age of Stipe Miocic. So inactivity is actually one of the worst things that a fighter can do to themselves. Basically, fighters need to fight. They need to keep their skills sharp. There's a lot that you can accomplish training in the gym with your training partners. But ultimately, fighters do need to fight. They need to compete, or their skills basically go dull. And we have seen that happen with so many different fighters in so many different, iterations of combat sports. I mean, Deontay Wilder, I think, is maybe the most obvious example. He lost that last fight that he had with Tyson Fury, and then he kind of went away for a while. And when he comes back, he hasn't really done much of anything since. He has basically been getting knocked around by the entire sport since coming back. And what a lot of people are basically of the opinion of, and I'm one of them, is that he didn't get back on the horse soon enough. Now his skills are faded, and now they might, they might come back and they might not. I mean, with a fighter like Deontay Wilder, it's tough to say if they will or not, because quite frankly, I don't think that he has the mental fortitude, to reinvent himself, to kind of gather himself back together and reinvent himself in the wake of a loss. I don't think that he has it. He definitely hasn't shown that he has. I don't think he's not self-reflective or self-critical enough, to really advance again after losing. Now, I don't believe that is the same. I don't believe that is true of Stipe, but the simple fact of the matter is that now Stipe, he's 42 years old. He lost his heavyweight championship when he was 38, and then he sat out for 4 years. So now he's in a state of physical decline. It happens to everybody when they hit middle age. So right then and there, he's battling against, that physical decline that comes with aging. And now he's going to, have to figure out some way to prevent his skills, from going dull or going soft, during that whole period of inactivity. While he's basically now sitting around just waiting for Jon Jones. And to me, it's kind of mind-blowing and almost disrespectful to the sport that the UFC actually allowed him to do it. I kind of feel like after Jon Jones got injured, and it became obvious that Tom Aspinall was going to have to defend his interim heavyweight championship of the world, I mean, Curtis Blaydes was a worthy opponent. I think that was a question mark that Tom Aspinall had to be able to answer. Because Curtis Blaydes, regardless of how it happened, Curtis Blaydes had a win over Tom Aspinall. So Tom Aspinall had to be able to answer to whether or not he can beat Curtis Blaydes. It turns out that in resounding fashion, yes, he can. But I kind of feel like that is a fight that definitely should not have happened at that time. I feel like once it became obvious that Jon Jones was not going to be able to go forward with that fight as scheduled, the UFC should have gone to Stipe Miocic and basically said to him, okay, you are going to have to fight Tom Aspinall. You've been inactive for too long. Tom Aspinall, he needs to defend this title, and you need to fight. And it is that simple. And I actually would have gone so far as to say to Stipe Miocic at that time, it's like you either fight Tom Aspinall or you are retired. That might sound like a very disrespectful way to treat, by you statistically the greatest heavyweight of all time. But I do feel like at this juncture, it's also fair to question whether or not, the greatest heavyweight of all time, statistically, has actually treated the sport with the appropriate amount of respect, or whether he has basically, in some sense, held up the heavyweight division, for a period now of, regardless of whatever your past accomplishments may be, and I respect Stipe's accomplishments, no question. Like, I'm not entirely sure if I agree that he's the heavyweight. That I don't necessarily agree that he's the greatest heavyweight of all time. But by the numbers, it's very hard to argue. I would say that I would be very specific about the way that I describe Stipe in terms of being the greatest heavyweight. He is statistically the greatest heavyweight of all time. Yeah, but all the same, but all the same, this is the fight business. It is the business of fighting. At a certain point, you do have to fight, and I think that the UFC really ought to have made him do that by now.